Welcome to the MusicWideOpen podcast
The place for an honest and thought-provoking conversation
about music,
business,
life,
technology,
and the future,
for curious music enthusiasts.
and musicians seeking personal growth. I'm Ingo Wunder.
And I am Paulina Wunder. You must serve the composer. You must play as it's written in the score. You must serve the music. One often hears these kinds of statements from classical musicians, and in a way, of course, they are right. But the thing is, this idea of serving the composer has several meanings. It is understood in several different ways and is sometimes used as a nice-sounding but hypocritical statement. So let's serve the music and let's set it straight. What's going on here? What does it mean to serve the composer?
I have no idea really. Let's start this way. I absolutely agree that you have to serve the composer in that sense that you need to play the music as good as humanly possible because that great music deserves it. I want to say that before we start what we start. Let's maybe start with the groups of people that I have observed in my life so far. And maybe through the course of this episode we will find a solution to your question, or maybe find out what's going on. So in my observation, there are 5 groups. There might be more, but at the moment, stay
anyway,
today.
a lot.
5 groups. So the first one would be, and excuse the names of them because I haven't thought long about them, but quick and loud is better. This is the first group. So basically it means just you have to play technically great, louder than the other person, quicker than the other person, and it's basically a bit virtuosity plus income equals success. Then the second group is those that say you must serve the music, which usually means in their translation, just deliver the notes and shut up. So they are against overly personal, emotional playing, which, as we will discuss, also contributes to the sameness of the playing today.
So analytical way of understanding the score.
Yes, but also analytical can be seen this or the other way. So anyway, but that's the second group. We will dive in there later. The third group is what I called Maria Callas, but there are many like these. Not so many, but some in the past. Exceptional talent, exceptional sensory abilities. And they're also saying you must serve the music. But it's a different serve the music than the second group. As I understand them from their interviews and writings, they mean that in terms of musical emotional expression, which is kind of proven by their own music, because you hear what they say.
I believe it's also more your understanding, your personal understanding of music, how it should be played.
It is probably because I was brought up in that kind of sense. Anyway, but this third group is often deemed by the group number 1 and group number 2 as too narcissistic or too self-centered. So they don't serve the music in some cases, not always, but in some cases for those first 2 groups. And the fourth group is play what's in the score people. This is absolutely not my personal liking, but they are playing just what they were told in their education without questioning really. So a little bit concrete heads. And the fifth group I will call aware, awake and open-minded people with sensory abilities that are really good still for nowadays, and people that keep the old values in mind and judge basically on a case-to-case basis. Again, as I said, I don't know if that's complete. I don't know if it's all right what I said, but this is what I observed so far in my life.
I feel that many musicians have a very individual understanding as to what it really means to serve the music. Some, I would even say, make the impression that he or she is the one who really knows how to play, how to honor the composer's musical intentions, how to perform his music, and so on. And if then someone else comes along and has a, let's say, a very musical vision, but simply a different personality, then this, I really know, musician is instantly negative and judgmental, and basically is not able to appreciate any other vision than his own and any other nature than his own. A bit like you serve the music as long as you play as I do and as long as you behave as I do.
But
isn't it like that a little bit?
I wanted to just say, isn't it something very human? I mean, we see the same kind of patterns in other fields or everyday life also. But here I want to also defend, because in a way these people, although I don't agree with them, but I know how hard it is to do what one has to do as a professional musician and as a professional pianist, especially what one has to sacrifice, how much work one has to put in and so. And for many people it's just so demanding that they just, you know, they think they went to a good school, they had a good teacher, and they might have had that, and then just take everything they have been told as, that's it, I know, I have been to the Mecca, I have been to the guy that knows really, so I know now too.
And that's the only way how this music can be performed and how the composer can be served.
Exactly, and with all the stress that this job brings, and you know, they don't just probably have time or have ever had the need to think about these things that we just raised here. So that's to the defense, but yes, that's a common behavior for not only one of these groups. I think this for several.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because there are many. I would say it's even maybe a subgroup of each and every of these groups.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as we have seen in our life, keeping an open mind and questioning without getting crazy everything that one thought one knew is a skill and has to be learned. And this is very important also for music.
To validate on a regular basis, is it still right what I'm thinking?
Yes. The core problem and the reason why we have so many groups is, of course, that we will never know how Chopin would have liked his music to be played. So we will never know this, except somebody comes up with a time machine and we can actually ask him. That would be nice. But so we will never know. And therefore, of course, it's a you say this, I say that argument. And there is no real solution for this, except if one digs deeper and deeper and asks himself why often enough, then one comes to the point where one can actually identify metrics, where one can go a bit further to solve that mystery that we will never know for sure, because Chopin would have to wake up now and say, hey, I want fourth scherzo to be played this way and no other way because I wanted it this way. We'll never have that. But at least we have people who studied with I mean, we have recordings of people that studied with his pupil. At least this is quite close, you know.
That's
if
true.
you imagine Chopin,
the tradition.
if you have Chopin himself living, you know, he had none of that for Bach or for Vivaldi or whatever. So.
Okay, and generally speaking, that was about the composers. And generally speaking about to serve the music, what is it?
That's a very good question, because this is basically the overarching motto of all of music making, right? Why are we making music? Music and sound and frequency is so deeply
rooted in us.
We are frequency. So one would have to ask oneself if one does music because our system, our body kind of needs that, that grew out of this, that we cannot live without music, that music influences us without us even consciously knowing so much that we need it. Or it's just simply entertainment, that you know, somebody started hitting a drum or a rock in front of the cave because there was nothing else to do.
Okay, but let's narrow the target group down. So here I would like to focus on musicians. How do they serve the music, really, honestly?
Well, in my understanding, and I can only answer that with a very personal touch, I understand the world and humanity the way that we always want to, actually need to go forward. Like we cannot really keep a status quo. We are not able to, otherwise we would have kept all the great things that were once great and kept it great, but we didn't. We
maintain them.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
We destroyed them. But we invented other things that are great. So in other fields, we again went forward. So in this forward motion, I think that we as musicians have to do things in order to bring the music forward, make it better, whatever that means. And that's the question, what it means to make music better, or to serve the music in that way that you say, okay, you were here, but some things were great, some things were not, and you have to analyze and explain why those that were maybe not so good need to be changed, and then do your part in order to make the world better, make the music a better place. This is how I understand being a musician.
Well, some people could understand that as a simplification. Let's modernize the way musicians perform or interpret, and that would be wrong, and that would be not accurate actually to say so. So I think you have to explain more.
Because I'm talking about the substance music itself. I'm not talking about if it's performed in a different jacket or performed in a different acoustics or whatever.
I say, of course, I understand the substance. We are talking about the substance.
Yes, and then one has to have real good arguments as to why something in that substance needs improvement or can be improved, right? And this is what I understand. When we play old music, like classical musicians do, then we have only chance to improve music in terms of the way how it's played, so the performance layer. Of course, some embellishments and some improvisations that are allowed, executed.
How it's interpreted.
Exactly. How it's played. And as composers, of course, we have more...
Excuse me, I would like to here stop for a second, because I feel that nowadays this going forward and serving music nowadays, it's understood in the wrong way. And I wouldn't like that you're being understood the wrong way, because it's not about the technical perfection, it's not about the accuracy. It's something much bigger than that. And as I observe young musicians, most of them focus nowadays on this very technical layer of playing, and this doesn't necessarily serve the music.
Yes, correct. I mean, you know me well, so you know where I wanted to go. And of course, it's not to even out the technical imperfections of past performances. This doesn't make the music better. What I'm after is the musical expression, always. If there are certain notes, harmonies, melodies written by composers, then he wrote or she wrote those in order to express a feeling, in order to express an emotion, in order to express a story or something that happened. And this is what he put into notes, wrote down on a sheet of paper, and in his time also played, so converted it into acoustic frequency, like into music, so that people could actually hear. And that's the essence, I mean, that we can improve or not, or the way we understand it, or these kind of things. So in other words, and this is what's nowadays unfortunately more and more missing, that people are much more after playing all the notes like it's in the score and play it quick and without mistake, and then it's improved, right?
Well, the computer can do it much better if one sees music only this way.
Yeah, it's not. But even if you program music and have no mistake, you still have mistakes in the musical expression if you don't understand what it's about.
Unless it's unimportant to someone to even think about these expressions, because the technical part is higher.
Yes, exactly. But of course, there is exactly the source problem that we have, that we cannot ask Chopin, Beethoven, or Mozart how they wanted their music to be played. We can only, well, not only speculate, because there's a lot of tradition. We know how some things were meant to be in terms of expression, what they wanted to say. And then, of course, how you say that core expression that they wanted can have a personal touch, of course, because an actor has a different voice, has different timing in their sentence building, has different articulation, everything. So musicians should have too. That's the personal voice, right? As long as they grasped the emotional underlying expression that the composer wanted. And this is where I see sometimes places for improvement, in that sense that I'm saying, hey, yeah, okay, that section came here, then he went into this, wanted to say this, and then he wanted to say that, God, I never thought about that this means this. And that's what I mean. There are still novelties that one can search this way, that one can say, oh yeah, that's the point of the piece, because this some things are very well known, but some not at all. Because one sees that if one studies the very old school pianists that were much closer to, for example, Chopin's or Liszt's time, then they play the pieces completely different than people now. And people now maybe think they improved stuff. Well, they didn't.
Nowadays,
because they changed the essence of the piece. Yes, maybe all the notes are now hearable and they weren't in the past, but you see clearly that the piece was going somewhere else than now. And so therefore it's not improved, although all the notes are hearable.
I don't know how that was in the past. Obviously, we cannot check that. But I feel that everybody these days is a specialist. And in music business, in the classical music business, one can see a lot of that. And I think as well that because of that, this serving the music or serving the composer became very watery.
Yes, as many things in classical music, and that's the sort of problem that we have in nowadays time, because again, I can be wrong with everything I say, but this is just my personal observation, that we live in times where it's sort of concrete. I mean, we are trying, in the way we build houses or the way we build software or whatever, it's like 0 and 1, right? It has to be there and
very
nowhere
square.
else. And people now in classical music have that source problem I just described, that nobody will ever know, and that gave freedom to a lot of people who just say something confidently and think they're experts because they have some degree or some kind of fancy paper
or they are coming from a musically better family.
Yeah,
or so.
and then they just, and everybody, we live in a free world supposedly, and we can say whatever we want, so that's fine. The judgment is in the ear of the listener. So, but people need to start thinking whether somebody has a point or not, and verify for themselves. This is the time we live in.
Yeah. You know why I think the classical music circle doesn't serve the music, actually? Because it's divided. It's full of games, full of business, full of resentments, full of selfishness and meanness. And when any ecosystem is so divided, it's weak. And when you're weak, by definition, you can't serve anything, just yourself. Words all of a sudden become empty, concert halls, stages become battlefields. I don't want to sound dramatic, but it is unfortunately like that. It's just not common knowledge.
That is unfortunately true. Here, of course, I also want to defend some of the people in the classical music business, because a general problem of humanity is that we compete instead of work together.
Cooperate. Yes.
Exactly. So this is everywhere like that. Business is tough. Everybody needs to live. Everybody wants to make money. Many people are greedy. And everybody is an egoist at the end, because
up to a point,
human
yes,
nature.
more or less.
Before you die, you will think about yourself and your family then, and then the next guy. It's kind of built in the system. But if one is aware of that, one can see that wherever people cooperate, people are more successful.
Exactly. This is where I'm coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
And here the cooperations are purely business related, not out of kindness.
Again, I think it's a bit of self-defense mode, because due to the fact that there are such source problems we just discussed, and there is the fact that educationally people just, on average, don't have the sensors anymore that they had 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago, due to many influencing factors, life, speed, and all the things that
we've actually partly already mentioned.
Overstimulation,
in this
all
podcast.
these things. So this is not nobody's fault. It just went this way. But due to this problem, combined with the source problem, classical music cannot sustain itself without taxpayers' money. they're on a life support in a way.
Exactly, and this is good that you mentioned that. And frankly speaking, again, I don't want to sound too dramatic or negative, but I need to mention, actually, for the sake of this conversation, I'm a bit concerned with the future that is coming. In Europe, we are European, so let's stick to Europe. In Europe, the population is getting older, and that's a fact. And there are some voices, maybe overly negative, I don't know, hopefully they are wrong, that in 10, 20 years, again, let's hope later, but it will come. The disproportion between retired and actively working people will be significant. This means more economic pressures. It also means that countries might start to struggle to pay pensions, because obviously in most of the countries there is no reservoir for pensions. They are paid out from the actively working part of the society at the current moment. If there is not enough money for pensions, then either the whole system will be changed altogether, and these might not be necessarily wanted changes, but needed, or there will be some cuts. And if there are some cuts, they will most likely first affect culture. For example, music institutions that rely on, this is what you said, taxpayer money, as most of them cannot be sustainable on their own. If that happens, then this whole situation will hit musicians, soloists, orchestra musicians, music teachers, and so on. And that could be massive. There would be less room for all these professions. The rivalry would increase, and with the power of gatekeepers, which we know there are some, that want to make as much money as possible, this could become even more brutal. I'll not elaborate what I mean exactly by that, but the thing is that nobody would be served then, and the least the composers and their music. And I haven't heard once someone of the people who focus so much on emphasizing playing what's written in the score and serving the composer this way, I haven't heard once from these people anything about how to actually preserve the musical, honest and pure way of interpreting, which in fact serves the music.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we try to do with everything we do. And these gatekeepers that you mentioned, exactly there's where the power is going due to these problems that I described, so the source problem and the sensory problem, let's say. And therefore, classical music has, and they didn't have that in the past, has a problem living from interest of the audience only. Like, if they wouldn't have the government
they cannot survive
them,
just by ticket sales.
Yeah, or they would be very small,
sales.
like it would be insignificant. And nowadays classical music is not insignificant, thank God. So because of the public funding that is still going on, there are big concert halls, big operas everywhere, and this is great that they are there.
Absolutely.
So not that we are misunderstood. But it's sort of a bit of a castle that is built on empty.
No, it's a sand castle, because due to these facts that sooner or later there will be a bottleneck, and it's always unfortunately like that if there are some cuts, culture and arts, music is hit first.
Yes. And in my humble opinion, the way forward is to work on these two root problems, like that people again hear the differences, the beauty, this magic that is in this beautiful music, and that the people performing this beautiful music are again incentivized of making it as beautiful as possible, and are as well able to live from that high art, you know. Like
very difficult,
because
very difficult, because we know that well that there is a big rat race going on, and they don't have that freedom even to think about how to. They just need to live. They just need to make their career as much as possible to earn money, because otherwise it becomes difficult.
I know, but in a dream world, and where we hopefully once will come again in the future, it is possible, because if enough people are appreciating this, what the artists are giving and working on, then it's not it's not the ego alone. You see, in the past, not that long ago, I mean, we're talking about a couple of 100 years. It's nothing on the global scale. People made music for a very different purpose than now.
That's true, but there was not a centralized business around it.
Correct. But this is, of course, in many businesses, it changed, and this is not.
Yes, but classical music is not really associated with business when one thinks about it. That's why it's sometimes difficult for other people to grasp, because they don't think, aha, that's another business. You mentioned in businesses, in different kinds of businesses.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the kind of the nice shell that the arts still have in, let's say, in the common opinion or common observation, that they're kind of, they are elevated into spheres that,
that's true.
Spiritual, church-like,
and they are dressed nicely,
and this should be
so
like this. Don't get me wrong. It
yes.
absolutely should be, because I sometimes call this musical magic. I'm looking for spiritual, in fact, because it is. People, the greatest artists in the past did music for a higher purpose than just money or just living. And I know we all have to live, and this is not what I'm criticizing. I just say that this music and art, if it could be elevated, and if there's enough people appreciating that, theoretically it could go back to a kind of balanced business where there's enough listeners appreciating that.
I would hope so, but with the amount of marketing around classical music business, which creates another stress for musicians, because they cannot escape this rat race. They just have to be there, otherwise they cannot survive unless they are smart. But it's very difficult.
I know.
Therefore, they cannot really focus on serving the music, really.
Exactly. I just wanted to say that in no way does what I say now here, or we say here, is to kind of criticize any musicians that are currently in that rat race.
Absolutely not.
Because I've been there too. I've managed it well.
Yes.
And it's fine if one likes to do that. As I said, it's a free world. Everybody can
Absolutely.
do what she likes. But if one has the possibility to think a bit bigger, or let's say from the bird's eye view,
to zoom out,
then one sees these problems very clearly, actually. And as you said, I'm also surprised that it's not being talked about.
It's not a wished subject, let's put it this way.
It's difficult, yes, because we are here talking about a substance matter that is very hard to understand. I mean, it's in fact very, very easy to understand, but it's very hard for the not aware to understand.
Yeah. That's why an easy solution is just to say, play this, what's written in the score, point. Which doesn't mean anything.
And that better than the others. And then not explain what better means.
Exactly. That's it. So.
This is basically what it is.
And then people who hear that don't ask questions. What do you mean by that? They just take it.
Exactly, because the answers are not straightforward. I mean, this is a very tricky subject, because on the other hand, if one would really sit down with somebody and explain each and everything with audio examples and with everything, it's very clear. It's like night and day. But if you just talk about it without actually showing, without giving this other dimension to it, it's very easily misused, because you can use the exact same words other people use. I tell you that often. I hear an interview of somebody who is absolutely not having that or understanding that, and he or she proves it in the playing and in everything he she does, but still uses the exact same words I'm using.
Yeah.
And not to say that I'm better than these people. No, I'm just I think a bit bigger. And also with our studies,
one needs to
with the studies that we do now, we already proved some of the things that we discuss here. It's a difficult subject, and in almost all the episodes of our podcast, we kind of touch upon this spiritual, magical, musical substance matter. And this is all, that's what it's about.
It is, and on the other hand, it was supposed to be from the start a thought-provoking podcast. So therefore we wanted the listeners to think bigger, to zoom out and not take things or words as they are, but just try to understand. Next time you hear something or you listen to someone else saying, play as it's in the score or serve the music, think for yourself what it really means. And if this person just says this because it sounds good, or she or he understands what she wants to actually say with that.
Exactly. And for the record, this is exactly what you should do with the things you hear in this podcast. Check
Exactly.
everything you hear in this podcast for yourself and validate it.
Yeah. Well, some things the listeners wouldn't be able to check, for example, the gatekeepers and so on, because you need to be in the business to see the bigger picture. After some time,
I don't mean the names, but just think about the structure of business itself and about how it works. I think it's people can research that, especially in nowadays times.
We both like technology, and we as well develop technology, and it can be a beautiful thing if one can use it right and do something good with it. But as well, it can be dangerous if one doesn't think much. And if we don't focus on these subjects that we've been mentioning or discussing in this podcast, so slightly, let's say, bigger subjects, not that we are so smart, but I think it's now more than ever important to ask bigger questions, to actually answer these questions. How do we serve music? How to preserve music? How to serve the composers?
Exactly. Because we live absolutely in one just has to open the news and it's not hidden anymore as it was a couple of years ago, that we live in absolutely transformative times. Nothing will be the same.
Very soon.
Very soon. Whatever soon means, but probably in the next 5 years,
yes,
many things will be really different. Many things for the better, many things not. But we live definitely in times where we have to ask the why we're doing things, and ask the why as often as we possibly can, because at some point the machines will do that for us, and then the AIs and neural networks that are programmed by people and might learn by themselves will come up with answers that might or might not be good for humans.
And also not for musicians, because AI companies as well, robots companies are growing like mushroom, and it will just create a very different world for everybody.
And for the audience again, for these people, that decide at the end who is where, or should decide, in the free market. Those will be influenced by robotics, by AI, and all these things, because they will live in a new technological world. And that's why it's so important from the musical perspective to ask the why question so often, and to go deep and to ask what is natural music making, for example. What is human music making?
Not only made by a human, so not only played,
exactly, but
executed by
what
human.
is it that makes us human? And because that's exactly the same route as serving the composer, because we have to go actually in the emotional layer of the composer, because he wrote these musical expressions because of his human emotions. He wanted to say
and
something.
Experiences.
Exactly.
That a human being can
have. And such great artists, they just put it into a beautiful structure and setting and just make high art out of it. But these are core human emotions. And if we don't ask in music anymore...
Well, I would say this way. If we just keep repeating like sheep, you must play as it's written in the score. So you have to have this very analytical mind to...
Without asking what it actually
means. Then, unfortunately, I have to sing, and this is not as... I haven't watched recently any sci-fi movie, so I'm not influenced by anything, and I'm not obsessed with it, but I'm just observing the news and information that is coming, and I see actually every day, because I follow what's happening, that this kind of you must play what's written in the score. This will be executed by any random robot in a couple of years, and it is not an exaggeration.
Exactly, but the thing is also, if we don't ask the why questions as to the musical expressions and the emotional background of it, then these robots that will play the music by themselves will play it according to the current state-of-the-art understanding of what music is or should be. And if that's very, very
well, they
on
might
the
improve
surface...
after some time, but this is not what I'm worried about the most. I'm worried about this, that musicians, real musicians with soul, with body,
flesh and blood,
exactly, will have just less space.
Yes.
Because they will not be much better than that.
Yes.
than the technology.
And due to what we just explained earlier, that this, let's say, sensory ability plus source problem we have in the classical music already decreased sort of the market. Yes, there might be some people might say, no, there are more than before going to concerts. We had that covered in another episode, I think.
We did.
But of course, in the percentage, in the social classes, it's not the case, and it just is a fact.
Of course,
isn't?
yes.
So, and it will not improve if it's not like taught in early education, if it's not taught in the first 7-10 formative years of childhood, if this essence is not being passed on, then yes, it's thankfully we still have records, we still have people that understand very, very well all over the place.
Yes, but
not the majority, but there are people.
Yes, but people don't remember them anymore. Plus, the algorithms of the social media don't find them. They put them very, very much on the bottom.
Yes, because the people writing these algorithms have absolutely no clue on average of what we just talked about. And that's the reason. Because if they would have already algorithms to favor better musically played Chopin or Liszt or Beethoven.
Whatever it means, yes.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
The fact is that these names are being forgotten.
Exactly. What I want people to take away from this episode is just to observe what they listen to be open-minded as to emotional expressions in music. Alone, if you never really thought about it, because it's so mainstream that people say, yes, of course, music is so emotional, it's so beautiful. And like, no, but if you next time listen to classical music, think about really in one piece how many different emotions there could be or are not maybe. And then if you're not sure if they are there or not, check other recordings, check other interpreters and see how they play such music and see if you find differences. So the first is always like kids learn, they learn by comparing things. Yes. And if one gets aware of these kind of things, that there might be something, and I can tell you for a fact they are there, and if one starts searching, then one forms the opinion, then one increases the sensory abilities of the brain. The brain is amazing. One can learn so many things. If one keeps plasticity, if one keeps learning new things, and we all can, it's amazing what we can do. And this is what I want people to get away with from this episode.
I will make it much more simple. Next time you hear someone saying you must play as it's written in the score, or you must serve the music, just think if this person really knows what she or he means, or just says that because it sounds well.